Maureen Blajeski. I am the Education Director for the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress. Today's webinar is part of the MDSC's Educator Webinar Series. This is the third of in our series of four for educators this spring. And the title for today's webinar is Curriculum Adaptations and Modifications, Communicating Expectations. So we're actually going to be recording the webinar today. The recording is going to start now, and we will have the recording available for view after the webinar is complete. So another housekeeping piece before we get started. In your taskbar, there's a question pane and a chat pane. So as we go along, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, feel free to put them into the question pane, and I will be sure to answer them at different intervals in the webinar. So I hope you enjoy today's presentation. I want to get started and tell you all a little bit about myself. So I am the Education Director at the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress. That's my current job, alongside my position as an educational consultant and lead special education teacher at the 321 Foundation Learning Program Boston. Prior to working more in the private field at the MDSC and the 321 Foundation, I worked for 17 years in public schools as a classroom teacher, a special education teacher, and an inclusion specialist. So a lot of what I will be talking about is based upon my own practice, as well as my current practice working directly with teachers in public schools as I support them to develop programs for students with intellectual disabilities. So that's a little bit about my experience. And I want to let you all know that this is the third in our webinar series. We've already covered the topics of supporting students, finding time to collaborate and communicate, as well as curriculum modifications, where to begin. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, some of what I am going to be referencing today was talked about in more detail in the previous webinars. So if you would care to find out more about these topics, you can view those recordings at the MDSC YouTube page. They're for free. You can just access those recordings at any time. So I'd like to get started for today's topic, which is communicating expectations. So our learning goals for today are for us to be able to identify the necessity for the pre-planned learning expectations when we're planning curriculum for our students who have significant curriculum modifications, and also to identify the templates that will support us with communicating these expectations to both students and parents. So essentially, we're going to talk about the why and the how of communicating expectations to families. You know, it's important to establish a routine for communicating expectations because it really will benefit everybody. Teachers are happier when they know what their plans are. Students are happier when they know what the expectations are. And parents are happier when they know what the ongoing plan for their child is, and when they know that their students are being challenged. It's certainly a challenge for us as educators to be able to set learning expectations that are accessible and challenging. So for those of us who work with students who have cognitive disabilities or disabilities where curriculum needs to be significantly modified, we're always working to make the curriculum accessible, but it is very easy to go from accessible to overly modified. And this does happen for a couple of reasons. So one of the first reasons is that sometimes we don't have our hands in the curriculum early enough to be able to modify it to exactly where our students need it. a lot of times we're doing on-the-spot modifications. And when we're doing an on-the-spot modification, it is very easy to over-modify because our goal changes from something that we've already pre-planned for a particular student to just helping a student complete an activity. And I know that in my practice when I was teaching, I would often find myself in the place where I would walk into a classroom. I didn't necessarily know what the plan was when I walked in, and there may have been a reading or an activity that wasn't accessible for my student. And so I needed to do some on-the-spot modification for them. And in doing that, I had a tendency to be in the position where I was over-helping or significantly providing a lot of support to try to get the student to finish this activity. One of the second reasons is that we want our students to be successful. But what we have to switch our brain and make ourselves think about is that success doesn't always mean that our students shouldn't feel challenged. And as teachers, we often err on the side of caution. We know that it is so easy for our students to feel frustrated every single day. And we know that frustrated students check out, they act out, and they generally hate school. Behavior problems are often stemming from kids who are feeling really frustrated in the classroom. And for those of us who work with kids who are often in this position, we try to protect them from feeling this frustration. And as a result, that's where I know that we can have a tendency to over-modify. It's kind of like as parents, we shelter our kids a little bit, and sometimes it takes, you know, a sister or an aunt or a friend to say, you know what, it's okay, that your kid can go and, you know, let them go play outside without you feeling like you have to check in on them all the time. You know, we take care of kids because that's what we do. We care about them. And that can easily translate into the types of modifications that we're doing for our students in the classroom. So bottom line, we have to find the balance between challenge and frustration. And it's not an easy thing to do. So an analogy that I like to use, I want you to think of it this way. So I just turned 40 this year, and in turning 40, you sort of reevaluate and you say, all right, I really need to kind of get control of my life. You know, I'm in fairly okay shape. I can keep up with my kids, but I really need to get more active. You know, I go for walks. I, you know, will walk to the park with my kids. I'll go with my friends, you know, for a chit-chat walk. Taking a walk is really my comfort zone. But I need to challenge myself. I'm going to try to register for a 5K this year. I need to get to the place where I'm going to run that 5K and I will feel really, really good when I'm done. You know, this is 40, this is what I'm going to do. So if you look at this spectrum, taking a walk is my comfort zone. Running a 5K is my goal. But something that would be way too hard for me is to register for the Boston Marathon. I can absolutely register for the, you know, Corab Hub 5K. You know, I'm going to do it and feel absolutely like the biggest athlete in the entire world after I run that 5K. I am right there in that middle place. If I don't do the training for the 5K, I'm going to stick within my comfort zone and just take my walks, you know, listen to my music, walk to the park with my kids, and pat myself on the back and say, you know what, you did some physical activity today. But I'm not really stepping outside or challenging myself. But if I woke up tomorrow and said, you know what, I'm going to train for the marathon, I'd burn myself out within a day. So when you kind of think about where I want to be working, I want to be doing my Couch to 5K training, and that's going to help me get to my goal. So when we think about our students, so much of the day for them feels like that marathon training zone. Just sitting in that math class or sitting in that history class often feels like that marathon piece. It's frustrating, it's really hard. And so what we have to do as educators is make sure that we're not always modifying into the student's comfort zone. We're not going directly from marathon training into taking a walk. We have to think about how to step outside that comfort zone and be in the place where students are learning. And we hit this place most often when we plan ahead for exactly what we want to expect from our students. As I was saying before, it's really hard to do on the spot. This planning ahead piece will get us into this learning zone much, much easier than if we do it on the spot. So the key to success is planning ahead. Before we move on, I want to just see if anybody has any questions up until this point right now. As I was saying, this is kind of the why we need to establish these curriculum and learning expectations, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the questions bar or the chat pane. All right, I think we're going to move on. So as I was saying, it's not an easy thing to do, but we can do it if we work together. So in my other webinars, I talked about finding time to collaborate and communicate with other staff members, and also trying to find routines that will support you in modifying curriculum. So this is a similar type of webinar in that finding a routine to establish a process for establishing curriculum communications is really going to support you in being able to do it across a student's day. So we'll start and kind of review the simplified process of planning. So the first thing we do is identify the essential understandings for the whole class, for everybody, based on the general curriculum. Then we want to find the entry points into the curriculum for our students. And then we want to create the individualized curriculum plan. So I'm going to give you an example of something that I did with I was working with a 6th grade student, and this is the process that we went through. So first we went to the curriculum standards, and this is for an engineering unit, engineering design, and we looked at what what the typical 6th grader was going to be expected to do. And once we did that, we went to the entry points for students who aren't necessarily going to be accessing curriculum at grade level. So highlighted, you can see where we decided that this student would be able to access the curriculum at a place where they were still going to make progress and they were going to be challenged. So in my last webinar, I talked about how the Massachusetts Curriculum Frameworks has a resource guide where you can really identify where students will enter each standard. And this student is entering the standard on the less complex end of the 6th grade technology and engineering standard, but we were able to identify the places where we really wanted to focus our learning goals for this student. After we did that, we came up with our individualized learning plan. You can see that this plan is broken up into 3 parts. We knew that we had some essential curriculum understandings that we wanted this student to learn, and we knew that we were going to be doing it through direct instruction and opportunities to practice, and we wanted the student to have some real experiences in going through the engineering design process. So those were the essential understandings of curriculum that we identified. Then we knew that there were going to be some vocabulary words that we wanted some vocabulary to be mastered by this student. So we really focused it in the person who's an engineer and to engineer as a verb, which was a little bit challenging to think about engineer as a noun and engineer as a verb, but this was something we really wanted to focus on with this student. And then for the student to really understand the design process for each step. So this is what we identified as the vocabulary. And in addition, we knew that there were going to be some broader skills that this student was going to be working on in this unit, and it was going to be around cooperative learning skills. This particular unit, there's a group project that we wanted the student to participate in, and we identified the very specific things that we wanted this student to grow with during these cooperative learning activities. So we said that with support, we knew that this student would require checklists, previewing, peer support, adult support during group activities. We wanted the student to be able to demonstrate these skills, to ask questions of other students in the group, to offer solutions for problems, to use materials appropriately, and to respectfully provide feedback to others about their ideas. We wanted the student to listen to what somebody else had to say and give some feedback. That sounds like a great idea. Or if you didn't agree, you could say, I'm not sure that will work because... So this is what we identified at the beginning parts of the unit, and then we worked on creating the materials that the student was going to need to access this curriculum. But before we started the unit, we also thought about what is going to be our standard of mastery for the typical students. When we look at this engineering design project that was the cooperative activity, on the left was the rubric that the teacher had created for all the students in her classroom. So there were going to be 9 areas in which students were going to be evaluated. And from this, we would determine whether or not the student was meeting the inquiry standards, that the inquiry standards of the curriculum. So you can look at the one to the left, and what we did for this particular student, knowing that this student's curriculum was going to be modified, we decided that what we were really going to focus on for this student in this group activity was their cooperative learning goals. So on the right is the adapted engineering design project scoring rubric. At first glance, it's very hard to see that it's a very different group of, it's a very different set of expectations on here. You know, we wanted to make sure that the student's material looked as much like everybody else's materials as possible. Obviously, some of the curriculum materials that we use were more visually supported, but we knew that the rest of the class was going to be using a rubric, and this student was going to be using a rubric as well. So if you look through, you know, number 1 for the rest of the class is that the identified problem is clearly described. For this student, it is, I gave my group at least one idea about a problem that could be solved. This was really important for us, that this student was going to be walking into the classroom with preparation from a paraprofessional and her special educator. She was going to walk into that classroom and be prepared to offer something to this group. And when you look at the 9 requirements or the 9 evaluation points for this student, it all has to do with those cooperative learning goals. And down the bottom it says, you know, where the typical rubric says not yet meeting inquiry standards, if you've got a score from 0 to 9, a score of 0 to 9 for this student would have been not yet meeting individualized expectations for assignment. And you know, this assignment would have been challenging. There was no expectation that our student was going to master everything every single day, because some of what she was going to be working on was going to be difficult for her. So we really wanted to see if we could get her in that place to be meeting the inquiry standards, or meeting her individualized expectations for the assignment. Sometimes we want to make sure that our students are always meeting the exact expectation that we want them to. And I think that that sells our kids short a little bit, in the sense that when we always make something attainable for our kids, they're not going through that process that all the other students are going through. The majority of our growth, or a lot of our growth, happens when we don't necessarily achieve something. If it's something that's close to achieving, but we don't necessarily do it immediately or do it the right way. We feel such a sense of satisfaction when we actually do achieve that. And I think that when we're designing rubrics or curriculum goals for our students, we want to keep that in mind, that we sometimes have to say to our kids, hey, you know, I've seen better effort from you, and today wasn't the day that I saw you work as hard as I've seen you work before. All kids have those days. And I think that it's important for us to give feedback to students with disabilities when they have those days where, you know what, I've seen you work harder. Tomorrow I want to see you put in more effort. Because I think all of our kids need that. A second rubric that we created for this student in this unit was around an assignment that she was going to be doing where the focus was much more around the content standards. This student was going to be participating in an adapted mini engineering design project. And this is the rubric that was created for the student related to the acquisition of the content pieces. So you can look and see that, you know, it's a 3-2-1 rating, and down the left-hand side, I followed directions about my final product. I completed all the steps in the design process for the tennis ball container. I tried hard and I did what was expected. And so, again, the student, you know, we know that 3s down the board, if that's what they're always getting, then we're not necessarily challenging them. You know, we want to see a couple of 2s when kids are working really hard. You know, and 1s are those days where we can say, you know what, I think you could do better tomorrow. A rubric really helps kids evaluate themselves as well, which is very important, because it's great when they can reflect upon their own performance and say, you know what, I only did one of those things, so I'm going to try to do better tomorrow. These rubrics really keep everybody honest about what's happening. So speaking of rubrics, I love rubrics, and I find that rubrics are probably the most efficient and clear way for us to establish those curriculum expectations for students. And something that has worked for me and for some of the teachers that I work with is to create a basic rubric template in the beginning. So this is the template that I use, and then I modify up or down depending upon the student that I'm working with. So I added the visuals on the outset if I'm working with younger students. For older students, I don't necessarily use the visuals at the top. Also, for some students and for some assignments, I may include a 4. I may have an additional column of expectations, but I basically have started with these 3 columns, and essentially I know that for every assignment I'm going to be assessing a student's, you know, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of the actual assignment. You know, for older kids especially, there are going to be certain requirements of, you know, I want the final product to have this, this, this. Whatever those mechanic pieces are going to be, I'm going to include in that following directions piece. And that's going to be different for every child, and it's going to be different per assignment. Whatever my individualized expectations for my students are related to the nuts and bolts of an assignment is going to go in that top box. And then the second box, I showed what I learned. You can see it's content. So what do I expect as far as my students' demonstration of mastery of content for whatever type of product I design for my student? It could be a poster. It could be a PowerPoint. It could be it could be an assessment where a student is even giving verbal directions. I mean, giving their verbal answers. Any type of assessment that I design for a student, I want to say ahead of time, a 3 is going to be 10 examples of this. A 2 is going to be, you know, 10 minus 1 or another number, examples of the content, or and 1 will be a predetermined numbers of the content. That way, after the fact, when you're talking to the student or to parents, you're looking at something very concrete when you're discussing a student's progress. The third box down really focuses on the effort of the student. All of our kids' efforts looks very different. And the more we work with students, the more we really know what it looks like on days when they're really putting in 110%, on days when it's just kind of like that's their baseline. This is really what we can expect from them most every single day. And then we all know what students look like on those really difficult days. And so examples would be, for number 3, I was able to stay focused on my work. I only talked about what we were working on, and I asked questions about what we were learning. I know that I've worked with students who, if they showed me those 3 things on a particular day, that was awesome. They were really, really trying the entire day. You know, and most of our kids need reminders. Those reminders really kind of look like the number 2. We still got through. You know, I checked out a couple of times because I was frustrated or confused. That's my baseline, but you know what? That's okay. That's kind of exactly, you know, that's right in the middle. And then the 4th column is I did what was expected. And this is a very variable column, because all of our students have different behavioral expectations. But this is a place where you can bring some of those behavioral expectations into what's happening as you're teaching curriculum. So if you have a student who you're really working on taking breaks when they start to get frustrated, if this student asks for breaks during this work session, that's a 3, because that's exactly what we want. You're starting to get frustrated, you ask for a break, that's awesome. You go take a break. You're advocating for yourself. So whatever individualized behavior piece can go in that 4th piece. So a rubric like this really looks at the whole child. It looks at the academic piece, it looks at the effort piece, and it looks at the behavioral expectations that we have to help develop some of those learning behaviors. Before I move on, does anybody have any questions about this? Oh, I do see a question here. Hold on one second. It takes me a minute to be able to read it in this little taskbar. So the question is, would you use rubrics like this during everyday lessons like math, or just for projects? I would keep a rubric like this flexible, and I think that for some students, I would perhaps use it every single day for certain subjects, and for other students, I may only use it for certain big projects. I mean, I have it written like this because I think it's something that I could use every single day, and I want the flexibility to be able to use that every single day. A few slides later, I'm going to talk about some of the other things that I've done to sort of try to keep kids on task and accountable throughout a lesson. But something like this, if you kept it very, very generic, you absolutely could use it every single day with a student during during any kind of work session. It doesn't necessarily have to be for projects. Do you use this process for students who are on alternate assessments as well? Yes, definitely. I would absolutely use it for students who are on an alt assessment. I think that one of the huge benefits of something like this is that it really gives you a lot of data at the end when you're looking at either these rubrics or any other type of real explicitly stated expectations for student. It really helped with the planning when we were actually doing the alternate assessment. And is it possible to obtain these examples in paper form? Absolutely. I am more than happy to share these. So what I can do is when I get the recording, I'll share the recording link with you guys, and I will also share these. I I will also share the Word documents of these, so you can take it and modify it for yourself. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to move on. So as I was saying, with the rubric that I was showing you, here's another tool that I used with younger students every day. This is something that I had a stack of with me, and when I would go support kids in classrooms, or when students would come and work with me in my office, I made this a routine for us. And again, this is designed a little bit more for younger students, but it could be modified for older students as well. You know, essentially, what do you have to do to get yourself ready to work? You know, steady and calm in my seat. I would quickly, or I would have the student write down the materials that the teacher wanted them to have. And I always put down that learning target on there. I find that establishing a learning target before students start to work really keeps everybody on track as to what's my big goal for this learning session. My learning target will be to show 4 examples of multiplication arrays. That's as simple as a learning target could be. My learning target is I will be able to tell 3 things that are the same about Athens and Sparta, or 3 things that are different about Athens and Sparta. And then I wanted to build in a checklist for a student on this one form. So, you know, first you're going to, you know, for some students, I write down, first I'll write my name on my paper, because that was something they needed a lot of reminders of. Other students, I would say that their first job was, you know, page 7 in their book. You know, it really depended on the particular student. I would sometimes put in, you know, if the student needed a frequent break, or if a student needed a reinforcement, I would sometimes write that right into the job and say, you know, first, you know, we're going to read this article. Second, you get to use your iPad. And again, I was talking a little bit more about the self-evaluation piece. I built in a little bit of a self-evaluation right at the end of this form, because it was just a place where the student and I, before we sort of wrapped up a lesson, could look and say, all right, here was your learning target. Do you think you met your learning target? You know, we'd talk about it. Did you do all your jobs? Where do you think you're at? And so the 3 pieces that I had were, I feel good because I finished my work. You know, this felt hard and I think I need a little bit more help, or I didn't work very hard and I was not able to finish my work. You know, that would kind of vary from student to student. I'd sort of change that a little bit, because sometimes it would literally be just an effort piece. Sometimes it would be more curriculum related. So it was something that I was able to modify and just use on a daily basis with some of the younger students that I used. Does anybody have any questions about this template? So another thing that I wanted to share was something that's a little bit more comprehensive that was used this year. This was developed by one of the teachers that I'm working with for an older student who was participating in the general education classroom for the ancient Greece unit. And rather than the day-to-day, which is a little bit what I've focused on, this teacher kind of did a syllabus for all the students, and this was the syllabus that she created for the student that with Down syndrome who's in her class. And this is going to be a long unit, several weeks long. And what they did was really break down all the curriculum expectations that this student was going to have. Similar to that page that I showed you related to the engineering unit, where we created that individual curriculum plan, this teacher took that and made it student friendly. So the student really became part of knowing exactly what her expectations were going to be for this unit. So it was 4 pages long, and those were the first 2 pages, and these were the second 2 pages. On the left are all the different curriculum vocabulary that was going to be expected for this student over this very, very long unit. And, you know, the first page was the topical pieces or the content pieces and expectations that we were going to have that we had for this student, where the second page really highlights some of those broader learning skills, the research skill. What did we want the student to work on and focus on during this GREASE unit? To be able to locate information on the internet to be used on class assignments. So that was something that we really wanted the student to have a lot of practice on, and to be able to demonstrate that she was able to do that. And in addition, we knew that she was going to need support through it, and we knew that we were going to focus on using text to answer questions, using a Venn diagram to compare the city-states of Athens and Sparta. And also, we wanted her to work and become a little bit more proficient on some of the assistive tech pieces that she was using. So using the Clicker app, we wanted her to use that as a tool to summarize lessons. So when you go back to, I will explain where ancient Athens is located and how it helped with maritime trade and helped them spread their culture. Essentially, what we wanted the student to do was to use her Clicker app and be able to say, Athens was located near the water, and being close to the water helped with the maritime trade, and it helped them spread their culture. And we really wanted her to be able to make those connections and be able to demonstrate knowledge of these topics using the Clicker app, which is something that we want her to become more proficient on. So at the end of the day, this type of planning definitely leads to increased student independence. So when I was talking about that, you know, when I showed you that curriculum plan for this 7th grade, for this middle schooler, the 7th grader, this is something that was referred to every single day. You know, when she, you know, today's the day we're reading about Athens and Sparta. We would look at her plan and say, this is the learning target that we're focused on today. This is what you're going to be working on. So it was always connected to her broader plan. It's really, really helped in terms of the paraprofessional support, because we know that a lot of times for our students, we are doing the planning, but the paraprofessionals are often doing the executing and the direct support in the trenches. And that's really challenging, because when a paraprofessional or the person who's supporting a student doesn't have a good overview or perception of what the actual goals for a student is, it's very, very easy to over-modify. And it's very easy to just really kind of hold a student's hand through an activity. But when you do this pre-planning, it allows for a paraprofessional to have the discretion and say, you know what, no, you know exactly what your expectation is. Let's go back to your plan, or let's look at your rubric. This is something that you have to do right now. I'm not going to remind you. It really kind of puts a little bit more accountability on the student, which is really what we want at the end of the day. It makes them active participants in their own learning. And, you know, the more often you do it, it really gives you a lot of data. When you save those rubrics or even those ready to worksheets, when you have those, and when it comes time to plan, either for an annual review for an IEP, or even for the next curriculum unit, or even when you sit down with parents and talk about exactly where students are at and where we want to take them, it really gives you concrete evidence of what's happening in the classroom. And it gets you more organized, and it really supports when it's time to plan. So, you know, when we think about communicating expectations, there were really two places where we're working on it, and both of them need a pre-planning piece to it. You know, we definitely want to be able to communicate expectations for long-term assignments and unit goals. You know, various rubrics, either assignment-based or unit-based, are going to be really helpful with you for that. And then there's also the day-to-day piece. You know, the two can definitely be intertwined together. But, you know, on a day-to-day basis, we want to be able to let kids know exactly what we expect them to do during that work period or for a longer-term assignment. And again, we're communicating it to kids, but this is something that can easily be shared with parents as well. And it cuts down a lot on sometimes the conversations of, I don't think you're challenging my child enough, or your expectations aren't high enough. When you really have your expectations clear and down on paper, it really eliminates a lot of the discussion around, you know, are your expectations for my student high enough? And it gives you concrete evidence if a student is really struggling with something. It gives you evidence to say, you know what, these are the expectations that I have, and this is what your child, this is what the student was able to do. So let's talk about this. Where are we at? How can we adjust this? It really grounds your conversations in data. And I was saying a tip is to just create a template that you can easily adapt, and this will make your process way more efficient on a day-to-day basis. So before we go, does anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns, or anything else you wanted to ask about this? Nothing? I don't want anybody to log off yet. I'd love to get some feedback from you. We have a couple of poll questions that we're going to be giving you. It'll take about 1 minute before we all log off. So the poll questions are going to come up. Let's see, hold on. Hang on just 1 second. All right, so the first question is, what grade level do you teach? So just share a little bit about who you are. Oh, I didn't mean to close that one. I think I closed it a little too soon, but I think what we're going to do is move on to the second poll, which is basically give me a little bit of information about what your position is. And obviously, if you're a parent, your position would be other. I should put parent on there. I keep forgetting every single time. Going to give it about 2 more seconds, and then I'm going to close that poll and open up the next one, which is really just looking for some feedback about this webinar and our whole webinar series. So let us know if this was, how useful this felt for you in terms of your practice or as a parent. Okay. And now I'm going to close this poll, and we're going to do the fourth one. And just all feedback is very helpful in terms of, I know it's hard to keep it's hard to keep focused at the end of the day to a webinar, so you know, all feedback is really helpful for us. right, so I'm going to close up that poll. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon for this webinar. I will absolutely send you the recording link as well as the paper copies of some of the templates that I've shared. And we would love to see you at our final educator webinar, which is going to be on May 12th. And that webinar is going to be related to just sharing some examples of curriculum that's been modified, just hopefully to give all the participants just some ideas about what it could look like when you're modifying curriculum for students. So we would love to see you on the 12th. Thank you very much, and hope to see you on May 12th.